We're going to continue our How We Got the Bible class. This is only the second week, so we haven't gotten very far in the Bible. Last week we just figured out what a Bible was, so if you weren't able to do that week, you're not far behind if you know what a Bible is. But today we're going to start with the earliest portions of the Bible itself and try to understand where it could possibly come from. So pop quiz, let's start that way. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Who wrote that? Moses. That is the traditional answer, and that worked for, I don't know, all of history until a couple hundred years ago, and people came up with different answers that we'll look at a little bit tonight and see if any of them are any good. But yeah, that's been the traditional answer for a very, 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 very long time. And it's a pretty good answer. Nothing wrong with it. By the time we're done, I'm going to end up, I'm just warning you now, I'm going to go full circle and take you all the way through all the alternatives, and we're going to end up at the end back at Moses. So don't get too nervous if I bring up odd things. We'll get to Moses at the end. But why might we think it's not Moses? If somebody said, I don't think Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, why might a person be skeptical of Moses writing those books?
Half of it was before he was born. Yeah.
Okay, quite a lot of it's before he was born, right? Especially, was he standing around in the Garden of Eden taking notes? No, that's not going to work. Okay, so that's odd, at least. What else?
Could be oral tradition passed down from generation to generation.
See, you're fixing problems. I'm trying to make problems first. Yeah, but yeah, it could be that this is oral tradition. That's one of the concerns. What else in the text makes you think maybe not Moses? Well, he dies at the end. Yeah, the very last bit. Trying to find here. This is Deuteronomy 34. Moses was 120 years old when he died. That's a funny thing to write about yourself, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, if God wanted to tell you, now write this, Ben was this old when he died. Yeah, I'd do it, but it's peculiar, to say the least.
Calling himself the most humble man that ever lived.
Yeah, the most humble man that ever lived, or this line here in chapter 34, there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses. Which is quite a thing to write about yourself while still living, right? There shall never be another minister at the Central Church of Christ quite like unto this. That's quite a thing to put in my biography, I would think. Colin?
I was going to say because the King James hadn't been invented yet, so he couldn't.
King James hadn't been invented yet, so it couldn't. Yeah. So yeah, there's a few reasons to at least say, you know, I've got questions. That's peculiar. Even the timing of it. So the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Scriptures that we have, just to kind of give you the scope of the problem, go back to between the 9th and the 14th centuries. Last week we talked a little bit about the Masoretes, the Masoretic text. It's a weird phenomenon. The New Testament was written after the Old Testament, but our New Testament manuscripts are older than our Old Testament manuscripts in terms of what survived. We have 2nd and 3rd century fragments of New Testament manuscripts, but our oldest Hebrew manuscripts are just barely 1,000 years old. So that's kind of interesting when we think about the Old Testament process. You can go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls and get as far back maybe as the 1st century before Christ with some content. But even if you go back that far, Moses should have been 1,400 or 1,200, depending on where you date Moses, years before Jesus, right? So my point is, the first problem we get into when trying to figure out where the Old Testament comes from is we just don't have a lot of material to work with. These are very, very old documents. And compared to the New Testament, there's a pretty big gap between when the events happened, when somebody allegedly wrote it down, and when we have our first existing copy of what they wrote down. And it's a pretty big period of time. So that gives you the scope of the challenge. And that's not even unusual, to be perfectly honest. we don't have a lot of ancient documents that are that old. They don't survive, especially the documents of slave people and shepherds in Judean highlands and whatnot. I mean, they're just not people that were great librarians. They don't have a lot of literature to hand down to us. Okay. But based even on that, until, I'm going to overstate it for simplicity, until about the 1800s, the overall consensus was still some guy named Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. My freshman year at the University of Oklahoma, I'm there to study science, but I'm a troublemaker, so I was in the honors program and I enrolled in Perspectives on the American Religious Experience. I'm a preacher's kid. I'd be in a religion class. And clearly, growing up in Bible class would prepare me for an honors class at a secular college on the American religious experience. Right? So the first lesson, I think, was the following. I was introduced to Julius Wellhausen, not personally introduced, but the idea of the documentary hypothesis. Like the first thing they wanted to cover in this class was the idea that you poor Oklahoma kids who came in here believing the Bibles, actually, we've known for a century or more that the Old Testament wasn't written by Moses or anybody like Moses, even if somebody like Moses existed. And a lot of that comes from a guy named Wellhausen. He had an idea called the documentary hypothesis. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I wanted to mention it because I didn't want the first time that you heard it to shake you to your core like it did me. Like, I thought, really? We've proven that? We know that? And his notion was that the Torah, the 5 books, had its origins in a compilation of 4 originally independent texts and traditions, all written centuries after the time of Moses. So you had oral histories passed down from various peoples in 4 different groups, and then not in 1200 or 1500 BC during the alleged Exodus, but more like 500-ish BC during the exile. Jewish people were trying to write their history. They gathered up all of kind of like their traditional ideas and documents and compiled this set of books and attributed it to their version of Paul Bunyan, right? A folk hero. They invented a hero for these poor, sad, exiled people to believe in, named Moses, and said he gave us these books and this is our story, and this is where we come from. Okay. The general idea of Wellhausen was there are 4 different authors or traditions that give you the Old Testament, the first 5 books. And they're called the acrostic, the JEDP. The J comes because Wellhausen was German. And in German, they made a mess of God's name, Joy. You can lecture us another day. But Yahweh had turned into a make-believe word called Jehovah. And so in German scholarship, anytime they saw the word Jehovah in their text, they said, okay, that's from the Jehovah author. There was some author back there who called his God Jehovah, and he wrote these verses. And then anytime they saw the word Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for, general term for God, broadly, they said, well, that's E. Well, anytime that word's used, there's some guy back there that called his God Elohim, and he wrote those parts of the text. And then there was some guy who wanted to tell the whole story over again with lots of moralizing and complaints about all the sinners in Israel. And we're going to call him the Deuteronomist. Guess which bits he probably writes? Deuteronomy. And then there's all kinds of priestly stuff. Well, the guy who told the J story and the E story, he wasn't concerned about priestly stuff. You know who was concerned about priestly stuff? Priestly people. So there's a priest text that comes in, and then somebody along the line edits all together, and you get something that looks like this, where different slices of the text come from different traditional authors, was the idea. Okay. It's an interesting idea. I mean, the first time you hear it, it's kind of fascinating, because if you read Genesis chapter 1, it tends to call God Elohim. And then there are other passages that tend to call him by Yahweh. Could it be that it's just two different people with two different names of God and two different stories? And, well, maybe, I don't know. It does get a little difficult in practice. So, for example, this is Exodus chapter 12. You're not supposed to read it. Just looking at colors. Okay? Somebody took a highlighter and they put the J text in blue, the E text in green, the D text in pink, and the P text in light pink. Couldn't find another highlighter apparently. That would have been nice. Well, what's strange about that is to make this work in some parts of the Bible, in the same 4 or 5 verses, you've got to have all 4 authors getting spliced together. It's kind of odd, right? But it's one thing if you say chapter 1 was by this guy, chapter 2 was by this guy, chapter 3. But when you say this verse, this sentence is from J, but this sentence is from E, but this sentence is D, and this sentence is P, it starts to become a little less believable that it was spliced together in that minute level. It would be one thing to say one author gave us Genesis or one author gave us Genesis 1. But when you get to the individual sentence level, it's become difficult to maintain. So since Wellhausen, people have tried to fix Wellhausen. What happens when you fix something? Usually you just make it worse. And so people just kept putting corrections on it. Like, well, maybe there's a 5th author, maybe there's 2 different E authors, and maybe there's and just keep breaking it up into pieces, and it became enormously complicated. Okay? So nobody in scholarship today is using what Wellhausen wrote verbatim. A lot of them use the concept, and a lot of them will still present it as that's basically what happened. But all of them that do the scholarship know that, well, it wasn't as simple as Wellhausen thought, because it didn't work. It was too minute a breakdown. It's kind of the same way. Okay, so Wellhausen wrote in 1878. Any major scientific discoveries going on about that period of the 1800s, say in biology? Darwin, yeah. And what is Darwin saying? In the same way that Wellhausen says the text is the descendant of all these early forms, Darwin's saying life comes from all these early forms. No one today teaches Darwinism the way Darwin taught it. Darwin didn't know about DNA. Darwin didn't know about cells. I mean, he couldn't know. But they use the general idea, and it's been kind of updated and revised. And so some version of Darwinism is taught, but not Darwin's version. Does that make sense? Same thing with Wellhausen. If you go to a school to study that sort of stuff, they'll tell you Wellhausen and say, but we fixed it, right? Because no one can actually make that early version work. One reason is they're really outdated. So 1878, just like we've done a little bit of biology since then, we've done a little bit of archaeology since then. In Wellhausen's day, basically the only manuscripts he had to work with was the Old Testament. He didn't have any, there weren't a lot of other ancient documents to compare things to and say, does it look like this or does it look like that? We didn't have it. Archaeology was way behind. In comparison, since 1878, we have mountains of ancient literature that has been discovered that kind of filled in the gaps of what the ancient world looked like that we didn't know. So, for example, a fun example is the Hittites. The Hittites are mentioned in the Old Testament, but in the 1800s, historians said that was something the Old Testament made up because there's no such people as the Hittites. Okay? And then you proceed a few decades and they dig a little deeper, and guess what they found? Like an entire Hittite civilization, just like the Old Testament said, yeah, there were Hittites. Okay? Well, in Wellhausen's day, they hadn't discovered the Hittites. So if you're reading your Old Testament and you say, what's a Hittite? We can forgive you for saying, I don't know what that is, that's weird, because it hadn't been discovered yet other than in the Old Testament. But since then, we just know a lot more than they did about the ancient world. There's a library called the Nag Hammadi Library that was discovered in World War II of ancient Christian texts that helped us with the 1st century. And then going back further, We've dug up mounds and mounds of ancient Assyrian and Babylonian letters. Hammurabi's Code. Who here has heard of Hammurabi's Code? Okay. Maybe it's taught today in history books as possibly the oldest existing legal code of human history. Quite possibly older than Moses. It's a big deal. It hadn't been discovered when Wellhausen wrote his interpretation of how the books were written. So my point is that there was just a whole lot of stuff that we've learned since then of different types of ancient literature that in a vacuum you're free to speculate. Now we know more, and it's kind of changed the picture a little bit. Okay, so now that was my Wellhausen spiel, so I can say I covered it. What do we know about the earliest forms of scripture or divine communication? Okay, we're going to not try to do outdated speculation, but we're not necessarily sold on the idea that there's like a Xerox machine in Moses' living room and he just hits print and out it comes, right? If it's somewhere in between there, what can we actually say? First off, early in scriptures, you read Genesis and even up through the first parts of Exodus, you don't read about anybody writing anything down. So for example, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. How do you tell the people in Egypt about God? Well, you say, it's the same God your fathers knew. What book were you supposed to read? Wasn't any book, and they couldn't read anyway, so it worked out. Like nothing had been written down, there was nothing like that to point to, right? They're slaves. And so God doesn't say, well, just have them read Genesis and get caught up, and then we'll start Exodus. There is no Genesis. Nothing is written down. But they did know stories. They did know enough that you could say, I'm the God that Jacob knew, and they'd say, oh, we know that story. Grandma told us that. And I'm the same God that Isaac knew. Oh, we heard that story too. And I'm the same God that Abraham knew. Oh, he's the one who told him to leave that country and go to this country. See? So they had stories that included God that were well known enough. This, if you read the previous verse, Moses says, who do I tell people that you are? And God says, well, tell them I'm Abraham's God. And they'll know who that is. And that's all they did. So they do have stories. Doesn't seem to be written down, but it is pretty well known so that they could refer to it. Okay. After that, you do sometimes have references to writing. Everything up till Exodus is always God said, so-and-so said. Towards the end of Exodus, we get a little different tune. The Lord said to Moses, write these words. For in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. Okay. So that's, if you're taking the Bible more, I don't even like the word literal, but more or less literal-ish. When you get to that part of Exodus, is the first time you ever even hear anybody suggest something be written down. Okay. Everything else up to then is done through storytelling. Okay. But that said, Moses is being told, write something down. So it's not too crazy to read it and say, maybe Moses wrote something down. But then you have another question, is Moses even real? Because remember, I told you a minute ago, one of the reasons that we have this concern is maybe Moses is just kind of the Paul Bunyan of Israel. Maybe he's just a folk hero. And maybe it's kind of invented. It's really hard to know any historical figure very well. Just an honest question. What evidence could you produce for me right now that George Washington was a real person? Like before you leave the room, I want evidence. It's on a dollar bill, a picture. That's the closest I can get. And that's obviously, if it was a fictional picture on a dollar bill, it'd still be no good, would it? So I mean, how do you establish the existence of a historic person, even a couple hundred years old? Now let's go back 3,500 years and prove to me that one guy lived, and this was his name. It's tough, okay? So I'm not expecting a mountain of evidence. I'm just looking for, is there like a thin layer of evidence somewhere that would make me think there's a Moses? And there kind of is.
Maybe Ancestry,
Huh?
maybe on Ancestry.
On Ancestry.com, you look him up and you find him. Yeah, works for me. These are the options that get kicked around. Maybe he's a myth or a legend. Maybe he's like a Marvel superhero. He's the Iron Man of the Old Testament. He's just somebody to believe in and make you feel good. Maybe there wasn't really a guy named Moses, but this story has been exaggerated so much that it's not recognizable. Or maybe he really lived. Those are kind of the options. If you got your Bible, look at Exodus 15 for just a minute. Exodus 15. One reason we might think there was a real guy named Moses is if we could find something attributed to Moses that looked really, 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 really old. Okay. Now you say, how does it look old? This Bible was printed like 5 years ago. How would I know if it looks old? Somebody want to read for me Exodus 15, verse 1?
Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to the Lord and spoke, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea.
Thank you. And then that continues through verse 18, but we'll not make everybody read. Okay. So they sing a song. Okay. Funny thing about songs is you can update a story, but it's hard to update a song. Okay. Think about Christmas carols. Don we now our gay apparel. Have you ever said that sentence other than in that song? Does any word in that sentence make any sense? Don, when was the last time you donned anything? Never mind trying to explain the gay apparel bit. So why don't we change that? And we put on our Christmas clothing. Why don't we do that? Well, because that's not how the song goes, is why. Someone would slap your hand and say, that's how it goes. Okay. And it's the same, Christmas time is like just a feast of that kind of literature. God rest ye merry gentlemen, and so forth. And, it's just, all of it is kept old language preserved. However it was written, we just put it down, right down today, and we do it the same, we don't change it. Hymns kind of do the same thing to a degree. Find an old hymn. Oh, sacred head now wounded. It's not a phrase I throw around a lot, but Martin Luther thought it was great, so there it is in the hymnal. We don't update it. Okay. So, this song, if you were like a fluent Hebrew person and had a manuscript in front of you, what I'm going to tell you is, it feels like Don me now our gay apparel. That this chapter, on either side of the song, the Hebrew is updated. Like it's obvious that someone in the process of copying the manuscript said, well, we don't say don me now anymore, we say put on your clothes. And then the Hebrew is, the letters and everything is updated. But when you read this chapter in ancient Hebrew, in the Hebrew text, it is older than the text on either side of it, as if it is a legitimately old song. You can read it. This isn't it. This is Old English. Anyone tell me what it is? Yeah. The Gospel of St. John, right? This is in the beginning, was the word be. Yeah, so you can kind of pick it out. If you know English, you can work your way through and say, I think that's the first verse of John. Maybe, right? That's kind of what it's like to read this chapter in Exodus. It's like you're reading Hebrew, but you're like, what just happened there? It is authentically older than the text on either side of it, which is kind of what would happen if it were a really old song, right? That nobody would touch it. It's kind of a time capsule. In fact, I'll give you even one more fun thing. There's a tradition in the manuscripts. Find a Hebrew manuscript of Exodus 15. Okay? You remember last week I showed you a picture of what a Hebrew manuscript looked like, and everything's kind of crammed in there real nice and tight. If you read a manuscript of Exodus 15, the words are pushed to either side with little words down the middle. It's made to look like a parted sea. And the scribes would write it that way because they thought it was cool. Right? So you have this, again, why keep doing it that way? It's a waste of paper and whatever, because that's the way you write it. It's just the way it was done. So you have an example here, even if everything else in Exodus was updated or altered later on, is there something there that says, wow, this is authentically old? This goes back further into Hebrew history to the point of time when we're saying it came from. The answer is, well, it's kind of impressively old, and it's buried right in the middle of the text. So notice what I did there. I'm admitting that the text of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy has been edited by scribes. They updated grammar and letters through the years as the language changed, the same way we do our books. But there were some bits they couldn't tinker with because God rest you merry gentlemen is just the way the song goes. And that's the song of the sea, and you don't change it. And it kind of is a time capsule of ancient literature. Other people have noticed that now that we've discovered more ancient documents, Exodus actually even looks like some other ancient documents we have. We have a treaty, remember those Hittites we discovered we weren't sure existed? We have a Hittite treaty that was written between some nations, including the Hittites, from the same time period as Moses is supposed to have lived. And what's in this treaty? Well, you get the title, and then you get the history. This is why we're here today. Then you get the stipulations. Here are the rules of the treaty. Then you get disposition and reading. That is, where is the treaty going to live? Interestingly enough, they stuck it in a box. And then they took it out of the box every so often and commanded that it be read to the people so they would know their treaty. And then there are witnesses, and then there are blessings and cursings if you don't keep the treaty. Okay? Want to know what happens beginning in Exodus 20? God's at Mount Sinai, and Moses comes up to meet him. Verse 1, well, here's why we're here. I am the Lord your God. I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. Let's get to some commandments. And he starts giving them commandments and stipulations. He says, when we're done here, I want you to put it in a box. I want you to take it out and read it every so often. Have some people witness it that this really happened. And by the way, you'll all die if you don't keep it. Now, that's in Leviticus, but it's like piece at a time, very much like an ancient treaty document would have read at that time. I mean, it's the format of it. I'm not saying they heisted the Hittite treaty and copied it. I'm saying if you were having to invent a treaty from scratch at that period, you'd say, well, this is what treaties look like. And it's written like God made a treaty with Israel, a covenant, and said, here's the deal. Okay? And I'll give you one more little piece, and I'll try to summarize what I'm trying to say here. This comes from Exodus 13, 17 through 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Okay. When I was in 4th grade, I was told to write a story for a class. And I wrote a pioneer story of some distant fictional relative of mine coming west as a pioneer. And I even got out a map to look at some of the locations because I wanted this to be legitimate historical fiction, right? At all of 4th grade. Okay. And so I handed it to my mother to proof it before I turned it in the next day. And she starts laughing at one section, which is always nice when your mother is reading your homework and laughs at you. and she says, we need to talk about this riverboat going down the Arkansas River. She said, have you seen the Arkansas River? There's no riverboat going down that river. Okay, what happened? Well, I had never seen it. It's a blue line on a map. I said, let's take a boat down it. And in my story, I had my guy take this naval ship down the Arkansas River because it is a blue line. Why not? Okay. My point is, if you don't know what you're talking about, it's actually really tough to write historical fiction. Okay. This, if it's historical fiction, is really good historic fiction. If you look at a map of the area that they were traveling through, the natural way, if I just said, the slaves left Egypt and went to Israel, I'd get out my map and say, well, that way, right? That's really simple. Instead, Exodus does this absurd thing where it says, well, no, they didn't go that way. They went this way and then went over, right? Well, what an unrealistic story if you're just looking at a map and making it up. As it happens, though, we have discovered in the last 100 years or so, the Egyptians had a series of 10 fortresses along this road of the Philistines to prevent, well, the Philistines from invading Egypt. Okay? If you were from Egypt at that time, you would know, don't go that way, that's where the forts are, it's going to be difficult, we need to go around. If you made this up 1,000 years later, those things are dust. You would have no reason to think they didn't just take a straight road from here to there. So here's what I'm getting at. One of my favorite Old Testament historians is named K.A. Kitchen. And he says, in short, we need to explain what exists in our Hebrew documents. And here's what we need. We need a Hebrew leader who also understands the details and politics of the Egyptian court, who's mainly from the eastern delta at Pi Ramses, who has knowledge of ancient treaty documents, understands the geography of the western delta and where the forts are. So when he makes up his story, he can tell us that he did win around the forts. And he also needs to be familiar with Semitic legal and social concepts to include in his fiction. Okay. Well, this is the point. We need a fictional author who's a Hebrew, who grew up among Egyptians, who knew Egyptian politics, understood Egyptian documents, but wrote a book for Hebrews. Oddly enough, I mean, if you don't want to call him Moses, that's fine. But Shmoses, apparently, we need, this is Kitchen's, in other words, somebody distressingly like that old hero of biblical tradition, Moses, is badly needed at this point to make any sense of the situation as we have it. Or somebody in his position of the same or another name. So he's, okay. If you want to call him Shmoses, that's fine. If you're just convinced, I don't believe in Moses, that's fine. He says, but we're going to need somebody exactly like the Bible says Moses was to even know enough to write these documents in the way that they're written. Okay. So, kind of full circle from Bellhausen, who's like, we don't know if this guy's real, all of this is fragmented together, to, well, we need somebody kind of like Moses, at the very least. Okay. Now, having said that, was Moses edited? Is this the autographed copy of whatever that fellow Moses wrote? And again, my answer is going to be no. And the example I gave is what I read a minute ago. And this is the ending of it, Deuteronomy 34, 5 through 12. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Also a strange thing to say before you're buried. Right? No one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed, his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses. That's the way I'm going to write my funeral. And they wept and mourned. Right? They wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt. Among other things, when you read that chapter, it seems unlikely that Moses wrote it. So what I would tell you when you say, where did the 5 books come from, is a kind of an amalgamation of what we've looked at today. There's absolutely oral tradition that predated anybody named Moses, such that when Moses introduced himself, he could say, you know those stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That's the God we're talking about. Okay? So even Moses is, if he is writing things down at some point, is writing down things people already knew. Writing down prior knowledge. He didn't invent the wheel. Okay. Somebody distressingly like Moses is responsible for a fair bit of the content of those 5 books. We need somebody from that time period who would have known what Moses knew to give us even the bare bones of this information. That was then passed down through the years, and scribes did what scribes do. They're historians, and they're scribes, and I would even go so far as to say, under the direction of God and His Spirit, gave us the books as we now have them. If Moses picked up my copy of Genesis, he might say, I don't remember that bit being quite like that, because the scribes did what scribes do. I think they were supposed to. But you see, it's neither one or the other. It's not that there was a finished product that came off the quill of Moses, nor is it that nobody like Moses ever existed and it's all make-believe. Instead, you can trace a pretty reasonable story of how people accumulated a story, how they put together these texts, and how somebody disturbingly like Moses was involved in the process along the way, such that for years ever after, people would say, these are the words of Moses. I don't think they kept track of which bits were in the autographed edition and which bits the scribe added. So I think they could quote Deuteronomy 35 and say, yeah, like Moses said. No problem. In the same way, I often say, if I read a psalm, I'll say, like David said. Well, even by the admission of the Psalms, David didn't write a bunch of them. Right? Or I might quote a proverb and say, like Solomon says, quite a lot of proverbs aren't from Solomon, and it says so. But just in general, we say things like that, and I think they're perfectly reasonable things to say. So that's my position on the first 5 books. It's what I consider, it's kind of conservative-ish by some standards, but it's a moderate position. It's a reliable story that gave us those texts. Those texts existed in some form throughout the history of Israel. And one reason we would say that too is the history of Israel doesn't make a lot of sense without those texts. A lot of the stories that follow only make sense if they were trying to follow this set of rules that was written in these texts. So when you read a story about thus and such happened on the Sabbath and somebody was mad about it, that doesn't make any sense if there isn't a text somewhere that says the Sabbath is kind of a big deal. That makes sense? Like you have to have some of that to even make the other stories make sense. When the story of David eating the showbread doesn't make any sense unless something like the book of Leviticus exists in people's knowledge for them to be able to say, well, he wasn't supposed to do that. Or somebody wasn't supposed to do that. So some version of it already existed at that time. Next week, what I'm going to do is kind of pick up there, a little bit short tonight, let you guys throw rocks at me and say, Moses. We'll have time for debating when they get there. Next week, I'm going to pick up there. John's got his rock. Big Moses fan. Next week, we're going to pick up there and say, okay, so at what point did it start to look like this? And that probably is going to get us closer to the period of captivity. I think we're really indebted to, and in the same way, this belongs to somebody disturbingly like Moses, this belongs to somebody disturbingly like Ezra. That we need somebody who lived about the time Ezra did, who put everything together and said, all right, let's make a nice, tidy package of it so we can carry it around and read it. So, already covered that. So conclusions, these are my conclusions, then I'll stop and you guys can heckle me. One, we do know that early oral stories were passed down from ancient times. Okay. So if somebody says, well, you know, that all comes from ancient oral stories, you say, yeah, that's not a disturbing thing. That doesn't undermine my faith in Scripture or God's Word or anything. Yeah, of course. I'm going to say it in 3 or 4 weeks, I'm going to say the same thing about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. That people were talking about them before anybody wrote them down. Which is kind of what happens when actual things happen. Right? I mean, that's... If the only way that no one says anything about it until someone writes it is if they made it up when they wrote it. And our whole point is it's not made up. So, of course, there's an oral story that gets handed down. That doesn't bug me. We do not know what form the earliest writings took. Definitely not this. Have you ever tried to write in clay tablets? It is a distressing process. We have some examples of ancient cuneiform in little prisms and things, and you can't write a lot. Okay, so before the invention of better paper and leather and so forth, I don't know that a tablet with 10 commandments might have been all that was written down for a while. It might have been that simple for a while. I don't know. But there does seem to be some things written down. We do know that some kind of Moses figure is needed to make sense of what we have. I'm going to call him Moses, that's up to you, but it's going to look a lot like Moses. We do know that the content of the Pentateuch is authentically dated to the era of the Exodus because the story has these old songs in it that are too old, and it has details in it that only kind of make sense if you actually lived it and did it. It's not good fiction written later. It's too detail-oriented from things that people probably shouldn't have known that we didn't know until we dug it up again. We do not know how much editing might have been done by scribes after Moses, which is probably the thing that irks me the most about Wellhausen, is the idea that you could go through and find which guy wrote which. Are you kidding me? I think there was an editor, and I think he did his job. His name might have been Ezra for all I know. But I couldn't tell you which bit was which, other than the part where Moses is dead is probably not Moses. In Joshua and Judges, no. In Genesis, there's a story where it says they went down to Dan. Dan hadn't been born yet. But the city that would later be called Dan is where they went. And so the guy who wrote it down said, well, they went down to Dan. So obviously there is some editing going on, but not loose, make it up as you go, whimsy kind of editing. Like, hey, let's throw in a new character. It's the difference between, I saw your hand. Who saw the Hobbit movies? Any Tolkien fans? Okay. They invented whole cloth characters to make one book into 3 movies because they knew I would buy a ticket. It worked. I bought the tickets. I bought the movies. Okay, and I'm a huge Hobbit fan. They invented characters. That's quite a lot of license to just say, hey, we have this great piece of literature. Let's add new characters to it. Okay, that's one kind of editing. And I don't think that's what's going on. But there's another kind of editing that's more like places, names, grammar, historical information you might want to know that the person writing couldn't have told you until this day, that sort of thing. Yes, ma'am.
So I hope I'm not jumping the gun on your series here, but so I always find it interesting. Me and the kids just read this pretty in-depth history of how they learned about ancient Egypt and the discoveries. So up until a certain point, they only knew about like the big famous people because generally they only wrote about famous people.
Yeah.
And so these robbers found this cave full of mummified crocodiles and it was stuffed with basically junk paper, like
Yeah.
people who were like, I bought this many things at the market and sold it here. That was the first documented proof of what lay people's life was like in Egypt. But up until that point, nobody doubted that there was lay people in Egypt,
Yeah,
even
yeah,
though
there's
Hopefully had documented proof that there were pharaohs.
Yeah.
And so I always find it interesting that we hold such a different standard to the Bible than we do to literally any other form of historical fact or documentation.
I mean, it's downright miraculous that any document from an ancient culture of Egyptian slaves is available for you to read, even a sentence of it. And you've got like pages of it that can be cross-referenced. I mean, that there is no comparison to anything else that we have, standard-wise. And we keep finding more. About 7 or 8 years ago, they had this kind of urn of materials out of Babylon. Nope, Assyria. And it was cuneiform writing on little bits of clay and stuff. And it turned out it was receipts to pay the Assyrian IRS or whatever. Right? It's a receipt for payments made at the Assyrian temple. One of the receipts records a general paying his tithe or whatever at the Assyrian temple, who is mentioned in a like random list of names in 2 Kings. And it's like, that doesn't happen. It's Rabshakeh, it's a weird name, it's absurd. To find his receipt that he was a real guy is amazing that we have anything, and yet we keep stumbling onto more stuff. And so when people can kind of point to the Old Testament and say, well, there's not a lot of evidence, there's more evidence for this than any other ancient literature whatsoever. We have more, I'll give you a comparison. There are something like, don't want to misquote you, it'll be a slide later, 2,500, as of like the 70s, 1970s, there are 2,500 Greek manuscripts. The number is now closer to 5,000 of the New Testament. Those are first century documents, okay? 5,000 copies. Josephus is a Jewish historian who also wrote in the first century. There are 3 copies of Josephus in the entire universe of ancient text. Means old books don't survive, except this one that we got lots of. So it's really incredible. Yes, and then there. Yeah.
When it comes to something like the death of Moses, and he was buried here, and Joshua took over. If you're reading a book by Lewis and there's an afterword or a postscript ever, we don't look and go, aha, he didn't really write it.
Yeah, right. It is the last chapter, right? I mean, it's an unbelievable place. You know, it's where you would put if somebody wanted to say, and this is how he died. You know, it makes sense to me. And even the Genesis bit, like the whole Genesis bit comes before you meet Moses, and it's in his own text. He never says, and while I was standing there in Eden, I saw, he tells the story, and then he says, and then this is me, you know, and then gives you the Moses story. It's the way you would do it. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about the Moses story, the Hebrews knew their lineage pretty much, even orally. They knew their grandparents and what tribal memberships they were of, even into their slavery days. So Moses, the figure Moses, was of the Levi tribe, the priestly tribe. And many of the texts on Moses were based upon priestly text, because that's the tribe of which he was a member. And his brother, of course, whether he was mythical or not mythical, was the first high priest. So all of those stories, and then you can trace the lineage of the high priest all the way through up until practically the New Testament.
Yeah.
But first of all, for anything to be written down, they had to have an alphabet. And it was almost into the Babylonian captivity before they had an alphabet. You showed that one last week of
Yeah.
a Hebrew text that was very old.
Well,
Written
that's an example of something we used to say things in alphabet until the captivity, so it couldn't have been written. We now, and you can go over to Israel now and go down into the tunnel that Hezekiah built, that mentioned in the Old Testament, and read the Siloam inscription on the wall from 200 years before Babylon. Not only did they have a language alphabet, they were writing it into the wall. And so we found stuff since then, and they had it earlier than we had given them credit for.
Well, even Josiah, you know, they found a copy of the law
Yeah.
that was
I was
written.
wondering about that. Or is that, what did they find then, you think?
Yeah. What did they find?
Before, what was it? Would they find something in the temple? And they're like,
So when Josiah found the law, we are out of time. Next week, actually, we're going to talk a little bit about Josiah finding the law, and we're going to go from here to Ezra and say, okay, what happened in there? Can we know anything? And the week after that, for all of you Apocrypha fans, we're going to get to all the Apocryphal books. So fun stuff ahead. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
Enjoy that.